Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to Afternoon Tea with the Shop Girls. My name's Sinead, and I'm joined today by my colleague Ronnie, and we're going to be your hosts for today's online event. We're both team librarians for Shropshire Libraries. I'm not sure if you're aware, but this week is actually Libraries Week. So that's a chance for us to celebrate the very best that libraries have to offer. This year's theme is Never Stop Learning. So through our events this week, we're particularly highlighting the role that libraries play in lifelong learning. We're therefore thrilled to welcome for your education and indeed your entertainment former BBC scriptwriter and author of the wonderful Shop Girls series, Joanna Toye. Welcome.
Thank you very much. That's a lovely introduction.
So before we talk about your varied writing career, I wonder if it would be, if we could find out a little bit more about your background, where you grew up, where you went to school, essentially just your life before writing.
Oh, right, my potted history. Well, I should first of all apologise for this actual background. If it looks very bleak and I sound like I'm broadcasting from a cellar, I'm in the middle of moving house, so we're not very kind of decorated. I'm looking with envy at a couple of people's backgrounds who've got their plants and their pictures up and their books, indeed, I can see in the background. I haven't quite finished the unpacking yet. So, my background is that I am an only child, and you'll probably hear a lot of writers say that their writing journey started as only children because you do live a lot in your head. I was a lot in adult company. We moved around a lot when I was a child. My father had various jobs in this country and also abroad. And before I had sort of established myself and made friends, I'd only really got my imagination to keep me company. So I think I would be described now as a bit of a geeky child. I was not and am not any good at anything else. I'd be a hopeless Jane Austen heroine because I can't, sew, knit, paint, do tapestry, all of that stuff. Was also not sporty, not musical. Books were always my thing. And that's another thing that you find a lot of authors say. They were readers before they were writers. And if you have a writing group in the library or indeed a readers group, I'm sure there's a lot of sort of cross-fertilization. So I used to make up stories. I had a shoebox of stories under the bed. And that's just really all I was ever any good at. English, I suppose, reading and writing. So I went to university, I read English. And from that, I went into the BBC. I've made that sound very easy. And to be truthful, it was easier in those days. I graduated in round about the early 80s. It was easy to get a job as a graduate, sadly not the case at the moment, and hasn't been for some time. And I actually went in as a secretary because I was so determined to get into the BBC just in any capacity. I had very poor, I had reasonable typing, but very poor shorthand, but I was very lucky that the BBC, being the sort of generous organisation that it is or certainly was then, didn't seem to mind too much. So does that help? I hope so.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Good.
Absolutely. So essentially you're saying you knew you always wanted to be a writer, or?
I thought I would love to be, but I didn't really see how that would be possible. My thought in going into the BBC was not ever to be a scriptwriter. I wanted to do something, I thought, behind the scenes. I also loved sort of history and research and reading about things which would inform my story. So if I was writing a story about, some medieval princess being wooed by a knight on a white charger, I would have done a lot of reading around castles or jousting or whatever. So I thought, well, research would be very interesting. So I went in, as I said, as a PA, a production assistant, hoping to progress to research. Always something behind the camera. I had no thought certainly of doing anything like this insofar as it's appearing in front of a camera. But yes, I always would have loved to be a writer. So I do know I'm very blessed to be able to have made a life and a career and earn my living doing that, because for a lot of people it is a dream, or they have to pursue it alongside something else, which is actually paying the bills.
Indeed, yeah. So you said you started at the BBC as a secretary. So how first script writing job?
Right. My great stroke of good fortune, it's always the case, isn't it, in life, that, you can have no matter of talent and skill and whatever, but so much is about timing and so much is about luck. And my second job, I had sort of 4 months in documentaries, and then I went as a secretary to the Archers. And that's where my association with the programme started. So I should say the Archers wasn't a listening habit in my home. Because we'd moved around a lot and lived abroad, there was no radio, there was no television. And by the time we came back to the UK, I was 13, and all I was interested in was Top of the Pops and, who was going to be at the top of the charts and things. So radio was a lost cause really for me. So I went into this programme, which, I rapidly learned was something of an institution. I joined in 1981. The programme was in its 30th, going to have its 30th anniversary. And I was absolutely baffled, really, particularly because one of the first scripts I worked on in the studio was the death of Doris Archer, who had been the matriarch of the programme. She'd been in it since 1951, wife of the leading farmer in the central farm. And sadly, the actress had sort of aged with her character and had become quite infirm and wasn't able to come to studio. So Doris was going to sort of die quietly in her chair, which she did, and there was a lovely script and it all went out beautifully. She was found by her granddaughter and, we did it all very tenderly. And the next day I was in the office typing away, the phone goes, I pick it up like, hello, Archer's office. And I have a listener on the end of the phone, literally in tears, saying, oh no, I'm so sorry about poor Doris and poor Dan, that's her husband. Where can I send the wreath? I'm thinking, oh my goodness, people really believe in this programme, not that I'd ever dismissed it or thought it was trivial, but you do realise that, the soaps, even now, the television ones, the people who are involved with them, whether you watch Coronation Street or Hollyoaks or Used to Love Neighbours or listen to the Archers, it's a real commitment. And there has to be a real belief and investment in the characters. So it was all credit to the teams that had gone before in creating in Doris someone who was so believable that people were, prepared to mourn her like a member of the family, really.
Mm. Wow, goodness me. So do you have a favourite storyline or one that you're most proud of in terms of the Archers?
Well, there have been so many. I think one that's recent and that I was involved in just before I left in 2015 was, it wasn't a very pleasant storyline. It was coercive control. There was a character, Helen Archer, who had become involved with a man who she thought was the answer to her prayers, but turned out to be a very manipulative character. And coercive control is now recognised as a crime and is much more, there's much more awareness about it. But at the time, it hadn't really sort of broken through as something that people recognised. And the story was just really powerful. It was horrible to write and horrible to listen to. We did lose some listeners during it because it became very painful to listen to when you could see what was happening and Helen, the character, couldn't see what her partner was doing to her. So it was quite distressing. But the good thing that came out of it was that, first of all, a lot of people made donations voluntarily to Refuge, the women's charity where a lot of women who flee these kind of abusive relationships have to go. And secondly, some people realised that they were actually in such a relationship. And one doesn't know whether they had the courage to leave, because it's very difficult. But that sort of thing, is the Archers and soap opera really at its most powerful. It becomes a kind of social commentary without making it sound too grand, because, a lot of my favourite storylines were just kind of light-hearted stuff about the pantomime or the fate. And that's the great thing about a soap, is it should always have balance. There should always be light and shade. And, I tried to do the same things in the books, because you can't have unrelieved horror, really. It just builds on itself and becomes a sort of cycle. You're just constantly trumping one awful thing with another. So the Archers has always, and I think it's partly because it's rooted in the countryside. So you've got the passage of the seasons, you've got church life, you've got just little village events happening all the time that kind of carry you along, whilst these big human dramas are happening as well, inevitably, in a village, just as they happen anywhere.
Yeah, oh, fantastic. I grew up on the Archers, and my parents still listen avidly every day. They love it.
Really? Well, it depends if you come from a farming background, I think. I used to sort of dread going out to the Royal Show and things sometimes, in case sometimes farmers would say, it's nothing like farming. But we had an agricultural advisor who kept the writers, making sure that we didn't plant barley at the wrong time or shear the sheep at the wrong time. So the Archers was always very well researched, which is why it was so believable and why people would believe in it and believe that Doris was a real character.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you tell us about other programs that you worked on? So obviously you worked in script writing in radio, but then also you moved to TV as well. Yeah.
I kind of dotted between the two, really. But I mean, I will say I feel I'm a words person rather than a picture person. My experiences in television, while perfectly good, I just never, for myself, I never felt quite so comfortable dealing with pictures as well as simply the dialogue, where the actors interpret it, and you've got the sound effects in the studio to sort of complete the picture. But the audience makes the picture in their own heads, really. So whilst I was, hang on, I'm trying to think. So I wrote The Archers, then the producer I was working for left and went to work. They poached him, that's what was then Central Television. And he took 3 writers with him, and we worked on Crossroads in the sort of late 80s. I went back to The Archers. Then I wrote for a soap called Family Affairs on Channel 5. And in the early 2000s, I wrote for Doctors, which also comes out of Birmingham, which was interesting because there you came up with your own storylines, and the production team gave you the ongoing stories, but you came up with your own medical issue of the day, really, that you wanted to treat. And I ended up on Eastenders for a couple of years. Again, taken with another writer by a producer who left The Archers to go to Eastenders. And I mean, that was a hilarious experience for me, really, because, well, for all of us, it had a very established team who were used to writing the kind of stories that Eastenders is known for. That is, when somebody has a row with someone in The Archers, they go off in a bit of a huff and maybe bang in a fence post or something to let their anger out. When you have a row with someone in Eastenders, someone tends to pull a gun or punch someone. So it was quite a sea change from The Archers. And the producer who I was working with said, look, don't worry, Jo, we're just going to do Ambridge in Albert Square. Because I said to him, look, The Archers is my home, I feel I know it, and I know every inch of the village. I know Lakey Hill, and I know what everybody does. No, we're just going to do Ambridge in Albert Square. And one of the first stories that he or we did was a story about people getting their recycling muddled up. And they were putting their recycling bins out on the wrong day. They introduced a new recycling scheme in Walford. And I have to say, it's the sort of story that we could have done in The Archers and would have run for probably a couple of weeks, and we could have got a lot of comedy out of it. On Eastenders, everybody was just baffled. The cast were baffled. The audience was baffled. There would be people on Twitter saying, what is going on? They were expecting a huge, great cliffhanger before the famous Sig tune came in. And it would be simply, you know, Dot Cotton, bless her, saying, well, I'm in a right muddle, you know, I don't know what's going on here. Doof, doof, doof. So I think probably it was a good job that the majority of my experience was on the Archers. And I think I'm just better with a sort of small domestic canvas and not people who live their lives in a very kind of high octane sort of way.
I'm not sure there's as much light in that. You were talking about light and dark moments. I'm not sure there's too many light moments in Eastenders.
It's a very different animal, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously you said you spent many years working on the Archers.
Yes.
So why did you decide to leave in the end?
Right. So I left the Archers to go to Eastenders with the producer. And the thing about writing soaps is it is something of a treadmill. You've got a deadline. On the Archers, I had 12 days to write 6 12-minute scripts. So that's quite intense. But on the Archers, you would get your story pack, you go to the script meeting, you put in a synopsis, you write your scripts, you get your rewrites. Within a month, you're back at the next script meeting. And it was quite a neat, tidy process. I found in television, it took about 3 months to write a script. Because the whole television process is just much more complicated. There are so many more people involved and sets to think about and people's availability and so on, which meant that I found it quite protracted. And my daughter was living in Africa at the time. She just had a baby and I wanted to be able to go and see her and stay for a long time. But so it's a very boring domestic practical reason, rather than like, oh no, I can't do this anymore. No. I couldn't write for Eastenders and take 2 weeks out. It meant taking about 3 months out of the writing schedule. So it just wasn't going to work. And I did think that after about 30 years of writing soap and having those constant deadlines, whether they were 1 month, 3 months, 2 weeks, 12 days, whatever, I thought to myself, well, you know, I don't want to give up yet. I love writing. What else am I going to do? Completely, you know, ill-equipped for anything else. And, you know, once you've been freelance, you can't imagine working for anybody else again. It's just really spoils you. And I thought, perhaps foolishly, that a novel or novels, I would have longer to write them, which you do. But of course, what I hadn't really factored in was that you're writing many, many more words. So if you're writing 80 or 90,000 words, it's only right that you've got 6 or 7 months to do it in, because it does take quite a lot longer than 2,500 words, which is, say, the length of an Archer script.
No, absolutely.
So it was kind of a practical decision. As much as artistic, really. It wasn't really me thinking, oh, you know, I've got a book in me. I left thinking I would like to write a novel. I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be, and then it came in a blinding flash that actually I had got a subject.
Yeah, so in 2018, I believe it was that HarperCollins published your first original novel. That's A Store at War, which was the first out of 6 Shop Girls stories that you wrote, and you wrote 6 in 4 years, and that's pretty good going. I'm now going to pass on to Ronnie, who's going to just explore a little bit more about the Shop Girls and your writing process.
Thank you.
Yeah, so great. So now we're on to the book sort of side. So we've got the Shop Girls series. So can you tell us a little bit more about the inspiration behind the Shop Girls series?
Yes, certainly. It started in a very strange way. Whilst I was still writing The Archers, in fact, I went to a very small exhibition in Wolverhampton about the store or store group Beattie's, which, you know, is such a familiar name all throughout the Midlands. The store had started in Wolverhampton as a little draper's shop, like all these big store groups started, like John Lewis, Debenhams or Marks, owned by James Beattie. And gradually over the years, he had bought up various shops around his original draper's shop. and amalgamated them all into a big store. And then gradually Beattie's opened other branches, generally around the Midlands. I think they went up to Altrincham and sort of somewhere vaguely southeastern, but it was principally a Midland store group. This exhibition was only in a small room at Wolverhampton Archives, but I was just there for hours. I was completely gripped. It had got all sorts of fascinating detail, really. At sort of those kind of bills that you used to be given, where the assistant would have written it out in beautiful copper plates saying that, you know, you'd bought a hat for 19 and 11 or something like that. Through advertisements from the 60s, you know, Adam Faith is in the, you know, pop star of the day, is appearing at the Birmingham Hippodrome, and he's coming to the record department where he will sign his latest single. And very sweetly, because it was very much a family firm, and anybody who's worked at Beattie's or shopped at Beattie's knows that it had a very special atmosphere. Things like, you know, the 21st birthday of James Beattie's grandson or great-grandson, and the staff had clubbed together to buy him a whatever, a tankard or something. But the most fascinating thing was what Beattie's had done in the war, specifically the Wolverhampton store, which, if anybody has visited, is a wonderful building, a bit like the BBC building. It's got a sort of rounded piece on the end where it fronts onto the square there, which had that Beattie's store in Wolverhampton had a flat roof. And on the roof during the war, they actually kept hens, which seems incredible, was incredible to me, because during the war, you got a coupon for 1 egg per person per week. But if you swap that coupon for grain, and if you could get hold of chickens in the first place, you either yourself in your home or as part of a club, just like there were pig clubs, there were these fowl clubs, as in FOWL. And the staff kept these hens on the roof of the store. Everybody took turns looking after them and kind of pooled the eggs, as it were, and everybody could have more eggs than 1 a week for sure. And they were very useful, not just for your own consumption, but to sort of swap or trade.
Yeah, trade with people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what a nice gesture of them, because that probably wasn't something that they'd regain money from.
Not at all. Not at all. There was nothing in it for Beattie's except for care of the staff. They had to give up part of the second floor to store aircraft parts from factories at Castle Bromwich. And there was obviously an air raid shelter in the basement. And all the staff had to be trained in firefighting and first aid. Also on the roof with these poor hens, they had fire watchers, just as on the roof of all these buildings, sweeping off any incendiaries that would fall. Although, I mean, interestingly, Wolverhampton wasn't much targeted. It was sort of Birmingham and Coventry that attracted most of the bombing. But there was the odd stray bomb in Wolverhampton. And it was just constant vigilance. You know, somebody had to take a turn fire watching on the roof every night from the staff, or more than one person, very likely. So it just seemed, you know, and war itself and World War II, there was so much drama just in the fact of setting a novel during a war. Mm-hmm. And I think, I don't know, it's sort of close enough in memory, even for me, who was, you know, nowhere near born, even at the end of the war. You know, my dad went through the war. He was in the Western Desert. I had relatives who'd been through the war in various conditions, really, you know, uncles who were evacuated to the countryside from Birmingham or whatever. So there's a lot of, I think a lot of us feel a kind of connection still with it, really.
I was going to perhaps ask the audience if anybody recalls Big T's, because we certainly as staff members had a little discussion about our experiences. I think most of them have popped in there at some point. I know it's not in existence now, is it?
Yeah.
But if anyone has got any special memories, do let us know.
Yeah, well, perhaps I'll say at the end. It was just a really special place to shop. So when I sat down to write the books, in fact, again, my daughter was going back to Africa, and she said to me, look, you know, you've given up Eastenders, what are you going to do? You know, you're coming out to see me for 2 weeks every 6 months, but what are you going to do the rest of the time? I was like, well, I sort of, I went to this exhibition, I might be able to make something out of it. I really, I wasn't sure that anybody would take up a novel from me. I was, yes, I got a writing background, but not as a novelist. So I just sort of sat down to write, and somehow the characters, it sounds very sort of blasé to say it, but the characters kind of came fully formed, and I was able to, I did base some of them on some of these family memories, really. My husband's uncles had been respectively in the Navy and in the Army. And there were just quite a lot of resonances, really, with things that had happened in my family.
Oh, that's lovely. So how long did it take to write your first book?
Let's have a think. Well, I had written 3 chapters. I wrote 3 chapters, and when you're submitting something to an agent, which really is necessary these days, you have to have an agent. I'd never had an agent in all the time of my script writing. I never needed one. When you're submitting, it's 3 chapters plus a covering letter. So that's basically what I sent on an email. And I thought, that's it, I won't hear any more. A day later, the agent who took me on came back to me and said, well, yes, I like this, I really like it. And I've just had lunch with an editor who's looking for sagas and I'm like, oh, really? Okay, that's all very good. Can you send me the rest of it? Well, I hadn't written the rest. I'd written another 3 chapters, which I'd held back. So I said, well, I've got 3 chapters I can send you. This was in June. And she said, yes, send them. So she came back and said, yes, you're on the right lines, carry on. So I wrote like a demon over the summer of that year, 2017. And by October, she was sending it out to publishers. And there were 4 publishers initially interested, then we went down to 2, and then they had a bit of a tussle between them. And I ended up with HarperCollins.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And I was commissioned, I know, it was like a fairy tale, really.
Yeah.
It's not how it should happen. And I was just, again, it was just timing, it was timing.
Yeah. And, you hit the right spot, and it was hitting the note with what they knew their readership would want. So, Well,
happily, yes. But I had no idea then, really, that World War II sagas were particularly popular, really.
No.
So that was very fortunate that I hadn't chosen to write about Beatties in the First World War, when it was in existence.
Probably good that it's naturally come from your interest rather than being a formulaic method of writing to an audience. So I think that perhaps is
exactly. There was no kind of artistry or scheming about it. It wasn't that I sat down and thought, right, this is what you need. I think it was, although I have to credit my sort of archer's training, really, because you can't be involved with a soap on the production team, which I was initially, or as a writer, without sort of absorbing some of what makes a story or a narrative work. The various peaks and troughs, and sort of managing the tension, where to start, where to jump off. The jumping off point is always really difficult.
How long you sort of see to one topic, the balance of subjects. I'm sure that sort of leads into what my next question would have been, which is about how research you do. But I suppose it's more about the skills that you'd already embedded and knowing, how much detail to add and, to write those pieces.
I think so. The thing about researching the war is there is so much stuff. When I was doing research on the Archers, I would phone 2 or 3 people, and then I would write some kind of digest for the writers of the main points. When I started, I went to the archives and looked at loads of original Beatties memorabilia and documents. There were loads of photographs. I went and spoke to former staff. None of whom had worked there during the war, but they'd worked there maybe in the 50s or 60s with people who had worked there in the war. So again, it was sort of just a kind of one generation's remove, really. So that was brilliant. I got to go behind the scenes at Beatty's, which was fantastic before it closed. So apart from the fact there were all these kind of, usual undressed mannequins with no heads and their arms off and things, there was actually the Beatty's rocking horse, which I hadn't kind of appreciated because we were moving around. I hadn't lived in the Midlands at an age when I would have wanted to go on a rocking horse. But this Beatty's rocking horse was an absolute mythical creature. A bit like in Birmingham, people used to go, the big thing was to go to see Father Christmas at Lewis's. In Wolverhampton, you went to Beatty's and you went on the rocking horse. Oh. And so I learned about this rocking horse and thought, wow, this has got to go in the books. So by the time I got to book kind of 2 or 3, the rocking horse was in there as a character, and he kind of had his own story. And he, it became a tussle between 2 departments as to who should have the rocking horse. So it was just a gift, really. Similarly, like I was saying about the hens on the roof and the giving up part of the 2nd floor for the aircraft parts, in The Store at War, Lily, my heroine, meets her young man, Jim, because his department has to move down from the 2nd floor to the 1st floor where her children's wear department is. And children's wear has to condense to make room for him in his furniture and household department. So they come across each other and, the rest is history, or the rest is 6 novels, really.
I mean, I suppose it sounds like a cliche to say they almost write themselves, but it does seem that in your hands, they sort of just evolve quite.
I think the thing was, I felt it was a very familiar world to me in my holidays from university, and actually as a Saturday girl, from the age of 16, I'd worked in shops. And I used to work at Rackham's in Birmingham in my holidays. And I just loved the atmosphere there. If the BBC hadn't worked out, I would have gone into retail, because I just think the atmosphere of big stores was so fantastic at that time. And I think it's something that's sadly missing. And there's a generation of people who will never know that, really.
And it is like a community almost in itself, isn't it?
It's a whole world. I mean, the joy about creating my fictional store, Marlowe's, because I didn't call it Beatty's because that's not a national name. So took Beatty's, called it Marlowe's, put it in a fictional town, Hinton, which is a kind of amalgam of maybe Dudley, Tipton, bit of Wolverhampton. But you've got a whole world, really. It's its own little society, from the owner, Cedric Marlowe, down through the buyers, through the shop staff, the shop floor staff, to the porters and the drivers and the warehousemen. You've got every bit of society, if you like. And the atmosphere in those shops, my editor said to me, I like the idea that I can walk in and smell the perfume in the perfume hall, and then behind the scenes where, it's always so tatty, it's always so beautiful out the front in these shops. And you go behind the scenes, it's all scratch paint and the doors are marked because the trolleys have banged into them. So, creating the whole atmosphere, as well as the characters, as well as the 3 main girls, which is Lily, who's basically, a girl from a humble background. Her family have never shopped in stores like this. They shop in the market or Woolworths or somewhere. And she meets Gladys, who has already been working at the shop, who's much quieter. Lily, because she's the heroine, has to have quite a lot of oomph. And they meet Beryl, who is initially a bit of a thorn in their sides, but it turns out that, there's a reason why Beryl is as spiky as she is. And, I think we come to love her. She's got a good sense of humour, Beryl, and she's quite what you call now feisty, really. So the characters have got to contrast.
Yeah. And so from perhaps the female perspective and this sort of the social aspect, were there any things that you wanted to sort of highlight? Like, I don't know, changes to perhaps women's roles during that time in history, or the mobility of
Well, it was really interesting. I mean, Lily's mum is a widow. Lily is the youngest of 3. She's got these 2 brothers, one in the army, one in the navy. And Lily has to leave school at 14, which was then the school leaving age, because there is no money to keep her on, although really she's probably bright enough to have stayed for school certificate. So her options as jobs, you know, her headmistress who likes Lily has her in and says, what are you going to do? And she's like, well, I could work in a laundry, or they're looking for a general assistant at the pub. And the headmistress is saying, well, you're better than that, Lily. And the headmistress gets her this opportunity at Marlowe's. So, I mean, in that sense, opportunities for women is something that, you know, these books can reflect. Lily's boss, whom she very, very much admires, Miss Frobisher, because the sort of quirk of Marlowe's is that even if someone is married, they're addressed as Miss so-and-so on the shop floor. Miss Frobisher is a bit of a trailblazer because she is working. She's not, although she's older, she's not eligible for call-up because she's got a son. And of course, over the course of the books, we find out her backstory, which, you know, has been quite a painful one as to how she's ended up on her own with this little boy. So there's a lot to be said really about women's roles. And I was so interested in the fact that, you know, women who were left at home in the war were as much having to kind of mobilize as the men who went to the front. You know, they all had to pull together and really, really support each other in all the ways that we've kind of heard about, that, you know, when somebody has a wedding, and there are, well, 1, 2, 3 weddings by the time we get to the end of 6 books, they all would pool their rations. So, you know, somebody's daughter was getting married. Oh, you know, you can have my dried fruit ration, you have my sugar ration, so that a cake could be made. The women were, you know, Lily's mum, apart from spending half her life queuing for not very nice food and not very much of it, she works for the WVS. She runs a WVS tea bar at the station, and she rolls bandages for the Red Cross, and she sends off parcels to prisoners of war, addresses envelopes. I mean, all that kind of thing. And the knitting that went on by women at home, just phenomenal. So they were really a kind of another army.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that kind of solidarity is really important. There was something, you know, a bit like it, in some cases short-lived, and in some cases it's gone on. I think during the pandemic, when there was a sort of we're all in this together feeling, and people were looking in on their neighbours and really checking on them. But, you know, then modern life perhaps takes over and everyone goes back into their own little worlds a bit. But it, you know, the pandemic gave us Zoom, so I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for that.
So do you write in a particular place? Do you have a sort of, you know, do you write every day? Are you quite organised in the way that you write?
I suppose the answer to that is yes, I am organised because of my kind of script writing training, and because I was a single parent with my daughter, and I had to get my work done in those 12 days, but only 9 till 3. So I tend to get up early, I work in the mornings, and then I like to go for a walk generally in the afternoon, maybe about this time. And I would kind of let what I've written sort of percolate a bit, and then come back about 4-ish and look over it really and see whether it made sense, whether I could improve it. And what I do is lots of writers don't do this, they don't like it. I read over what I've written the day before I start in the morning.
Yeah.
Because I like to sort of correct and revise as I go along.
Yeah.
Whereas some writers, they write a first draft in a kind of blast of white heat, and then they'll go back and do it again. And sometimes what they put into their editor is, I don't mean to say not very polished, but it just depends how you work. Some people are much better at rewrites. And they like to do rewrites. I've never really liked rewrites. I like to try and get it right first time, or at least right for me.
Yeah, that's nice.
And you just have to hope it's right for your editor. I've been very lucky with my editor. We're very much on the same page, you might say. And so I haven't had much editorial, I want to say interference, that's what they're there for, you know. And there's been lots and lots of improvements made by my editor and my agent. Particularly because I think when you get to the end of sort of 80,000-90,000 words, you're a bit tired. And I think on about 3 occasions in the books, my agent has said to me, because she has the first read of it before we submit to my editor at HarperCollins, can you just extend the end a bit? You know, I was just kind of couldn't wait to type the end. So I was like, yes, you're right. You know, perhaps that proposal is a bit quick.
Yeah.
Or
And
whatever.
is there for you a favourite moment from being a published author? You've got anything that's in your mind?
I think really the first time, the thing about these sort of books is they are sold in supermarkets in quite big numbers. When they first come out, they're often in that sort of, you know, 2 for £8 kind of offer. And I was just so thrilled to walk into Tesco or somewhere and see that I was on a shelf.
Must be fantastic.
It is a lovely, lovely moment. And I've been just very lucky with the publishers. They put a lot of work into the covers, which have changed along the way as we sort of got to know, or perhaps, you know, we all felt a bit more comfortable with what the series was about. You know, they've got to be striking and eye-catching because you only have about 6 weeks in the supermarkets. And then, unfortunately for me, it was quite difficult becoming known during the pandemic. So two books came out, and then we were in various lockdowns. So nobody was going to supermarkets. And with buying online, unless you're looking for a specific name, it's very difficult. So it's, you know, it's been a really interesting time to be changing what I write, really. But happily, very much the last 2 have come out since the end of the pandemic, insofar as, you know, we think it is over. So that's been much easier, really, to sort of establish those 2. But I mean, the hope is, the thing about the books is they're all standalone. So it doesn't matter if you can't get the book you want from the library, you can start at book 3 and then just carry on, or you can work backwards. Everybody is explained and reintroduced in a, you know, in a short way. So that, and ideally the characters are so distinctive that their own voice, literally their voice when they're speaking, is so well distinctive enough that you think, oh yes, I got the idea. That's who Beryl is. She's the one who's always ready with a smart put down, or what have you.
Wonderful, thank you. Shauna, do you want to lead on future plans with Jen?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously we've been with the girls through their lives and loves for quite a while now. So can you confirm whether Wedding Bells for the Victory Girls is definitely the last?
Well, no, you never say never. You absolutely never say never. And the thing is, I mean, I've treated it like a soap, in that the stories, it starts in June 1941 and we go right through to June 1946. So we go a little bit post-war. I genuinely thought that at the end of 6 books, that was it. You know, I thought I'd brought everybody to a satisfactory conclusion. The good had ended well, and the bad people, insofar as there are bad people, because I mean, this is feel-good stuff, you know, it's not like nasty, but you know, the people who were a bit roguish had kind of ended badly or got their comeuppance. But then, of course, I started to think about it, and I'm like, well, but what if? And what happens when? And if so-and-so. So I haven't entirely put them away, because, you know, I've lived with these characters for a long time. And it sounds really corny, but I feel like they're kind of like family to me. So it's been quite hard to say, that's it, I'm closing the door on you, Lily, bye, get on with your life. So there's a bit of me that would actually love to go kind of into the 50s, because Beryl and Gladys have children by the end of the books. And I would love to see Beryl's son, Bobby, particularly, turn into a teddy boy in the 50s, and I could have a lot of fun with that. But, you know, that's all, it's not down to me. It's not down to me. It's about what publishers want, and, you know, if my editor wants more, and so on and so forth. So the jury's out a bit.
Right, okay. Are you working on anything at the moment then? Or
at the moment, not really. I am, I apologise in my background, I'm doing a lot of unpacking boxes. So, you know, but I don't think there's a novel in moving house, really, not for me. I do serials, magazine serials, and I've got a couple of those coming out. So that's really what I've been doing this year. I've got a nice editor at Women's Weekly, who I work for. And that's interesting, because that's sort of a bit like the research that I used to do for the Archers. So, you know, for kind of 3 weeks, I might be researching medieval again, or Victorian countryside life, or life in the trenches in the First World War, in order to write, what's basically a romantic serial about that kind of thing. So I think the next one will be in Women's Weekly in January or something. It's a long lead time on those. Yeah. Some contemporary and some historical.
Oh, okay, fantastic. So I'm keen, obviously, to ask audience members if they have any questions. So if you do, just pop them in the chat, and Ronnie will lead on those. But just one more question from me is, how can people find out more about you and what you're up to next?
Right, so I've got a Facebook page, which is Facebook, blah, 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 Joanna Toye writer. That's good. Basically, I mean, say, read the books, whether you get them from the library, or they are, of course, still all on Amazon. I mean, what I put on the Facebook page is sort of quite often book related. Sometimes it's about me, I'm off for a nice weekend at the seaside, but very often it's book related, things that I have used for research, just things that occur to me that spring off the books, really. I've got a whole shelf of World War II type stuff, World War II diaries that have been published. So kind of memoir and diary I read quite a lot of. Lovely books. There's a great book called Fashion on the Ration, which was very helpful in working out, how Lily's mum, Dora, who's a great sewer and knitter, can adapt clothes so that they can last another season, because everybody was doing all that make, do and mend. So yeah, I mean, I think Facebook is probably the best place to find me. Thank you.
Okay, so let me see if there are any. Oh, we actually have some comments from Bev, recalling BT's last visit soon before it closed. I bought a lovely bottle of perfume in there before a meal and a gig at the Civic Hall. Brilliant.
Oh, wow.
Excellent.
Yes. What a perfect day. Yeah, I think a lot of people, I mean, it's really nice. I think this just sort of provokes memories of shopping in BT's or your local equivalent, when they were just really impressive places. And in the war, it would have been such a wonderful thing to go into a store, even though they had that splinter net tape across the windows, or iron grills, or, they only had the lights on half, and, some had been bomb damaged and so on and so forth. But, houses were not very comfortable in those days. And even in the early stages of the war, before some of the real worst rationing came in, it would have felt like, being in Hollywood, going into a store with marble and glass, for the same reason cinemas were absolutely wonderful in those days, those fabulous Odeons. You still see the buildings, and occasionally there's a little bit of the interior still. That was just somewhere that was like a palace compared with home, where there'd be lino and not much heat, and an outside toilet and all that kind of thing.
You'd be craving for some glamour, wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly. Glamour is the word. Yeah, precisely.
Oh, I've got a question here from Catherine. She says the series is wonderful and very visual. Would you like to adapt it for TV and write the script?
Well, I would love to see it on TV. Absolutely love it. Somebody sweetly described it as a cross between Mr. Selfridge and Call the Midwife. In the sense, I think that, yes, it's set in and around a shop, but it's got, I hope, that kind of community feel that I was talking about, with all the women in the street helping each other out and so on and so forth. I would absolutely love to see it on television. Whether I'm the right person to write the script is another matter, because I think I would find it very difficult to cut it down, because every page is my favourite page for one reason or another. And very often when you hear writers say this, and I'm thinking about, say, Anne Cleeves, whose books of Vera and the Shetland, she's handed those over to specifically television writers to do, and there's something a bit like kind of passing on the baton, really.
Yeah,
I might not be the best person, despite my background and experience, But it would be a lovely thought. I mean, the only difficulty I would have is in casting it, because I'm just not very good on young contemporary actors. And Lily is only 14 when we start. I mean, you'd want someone who's probably just out of drama school but looks young, who'd be a rising star like all the young women were in Call the Midwife. When that started all those years ago, nobody had heard of the girls who were in the main roles, but now they're household names. So yes, thank you for the question. It would be lovely. Perhaps you could write to the controller of BBC One and suggest it.
Any further questions? Have you got any members?
Yeah, I've seen comments popping up, people saying about their memories. Happy days.
Oh yeah, I remember beaches when we lived in Solihull. This is Mary. It's sad that
Yes.
those stores have died out now. We absolutely did.
I know. Well, part of my growing up, my secondary schooling was in Solihull, and my mum used to like live for BT sales, because it was expensive. It was a bit posh, and it was like BT sale. I must get down there. So I was like, I was a teen, like, surely not. But it was just, it was, and people in Solihull, I think, still this day, although it's House of Fraser now, say, oh, I'm going for coffee at Beatty's. And it's the same, in Wolverhampton, Beatty's name stayed above the door, and it is still above the door, for all that the store is being redeveloped. It's being sort of hollowed out, and it's going to be flats, I think, mostly. But they're keeping the facade, which is good.
Yeah, I certainly remember visits to Beatty's with my parents. Whenever there was a wedding or a christening coming up, it was like, well, we've got to go to Beatty's to buy our outfits.
Yeah. You went to, it was for something special, wasn't it? And perfume, as somebody mentioned, was a classic. And to go in at Christmas, the decoration was always super. The windows looked fabulous. It was kind of a cut above. I think, what was their slogan? It was the place to shop, or the place to shop in a way. So I gave Marlowe's the slogan, nothing but the best. And, the staff who work there, who probably even with their discount can't afford a lot of what's in there, are like, nothing but the best for the best, So yeah, it had a certain kind of clientele, really. Good old Beatty's. Yeah. But anyway, there we are. Progress, apparently.
Well, yeah.
It's not the same online, is it?
No.
I don't think we'll all be looking back and thinking fondly of our clicking and
absolutely, yes, that was fun, getting another package at the door that didn't fit. Yeah. Exactly.
Oh, that's lovely. Any further questions at all? So we're hitting the 26 minutes past, so it's probably getting time that we should be winding up.
Getting time to have my tea, which has gone cold.
Likewise.
I have about 3 sheets of questions for you, Jo, that we didn't manage to get to.
Oh well, another time.
No, absolutely.
Okay.
I was just thinking, what of one though, in particular, if there are any writers that inspire you, or any books that you wish that you had written.
Oh, so many. Most of English literature. Where shall I start? Works of Shakespeare, perhaps. One of my real favourite authors is Daphne De Maria. I just think she was so clever. She wrote so many, she was kind of dismissed as a romance author, which is so unfair, because she wrote so much more than romance. She wrote all kind of thriller type things and really haunting psychological mysteries. I would love to have written Rebecca. I think that's just a wonderful book. I could watch the film over and over. I love all those black and white films, and actually that really helped me with a lot of research and a lot of the sort of just the way people spoke for the books. So I would say Daphne Du Maurier, and the whole thing about romance and the way that romance and sagas are a little bit, how can I put it, almost looked down on, and I just think it's so silly and elitist and unfair. Because, writing these kind of books, and, I'm a very novice saga writer. There are many more experienced writers out there who do very, very well and have been doing it for years and do it brilliantly. And, we ought to give credit to the Romantic Novelists Association that's been going for ages, that brings through people through their new writer scheme. You know, it didn't apply to me because my background's different. But there was a big scandal not so long ago. The Sunday Times did its books of the year, and there wasn't a single romance novel in there, despite the fact, you know, and I'm talking about not just historical, but contemporary romance as well. People like Katie Ford or Philippa Ashley, who'd been in the top 10, but they were just ignored, as if this was just like, oh, trivial women's stuff. Don't bother your pretty heads about it. No, I don't think so. It's a book like any other. Just like Lee Child, you know, he doesn't make great claims for his books, but they sell in their millions and they're really good of their kind, if that's your thing. James Patterson, whoever. So there's a lot of kind of book snobbery just because you're not writing something that's going to win the Booker or even, you know, the Women's Prize or something. It's of its kind and in its genre. We can all hold our heads up, I think, and don't ever feel that, you know, don't ever be ashamed of enjoying romance. It makes the world go round.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think in these challenging times that we live in, I think just an uplifting saga is just what you need, honestly.
It is what you need. I mean, I can only write what I write, and I can only write the kind of book that I would want to read. They're very easy reads, they're very light. And at the end of it, I just want people to have a smile on their face. You know, some sagas, having said all I've said, and they're all good in their way, are quite, what I'd say, gritty. You know, you might have real unpleasantness in the home, a violent father or an alcoholic or something like that, or just mothers who, for reasons of poverty or hardship or just having too many children, are really mean to one or other. And you know, that's not for me. That's a kind of saga that works for some people. The kind of grinding poverty. You know, Lily's from a humble background, but then they're not absolutely on the breadline. And therefore, you're kind of starting from a position where people can improve themselves. And there was such an urge for education and to sort of get on in those days. It's very touching, really. So yeah, I hope people just find the books and enjoy them. That's the only message, really.
Well, we do have all copies, luckily, at Shropshire Libraries, and on our e-library as well.
Oh, brilliant!
So,
yeah,
yeah, which is getting more
fantastic. That's been a real boon to people.
And of course, available through online stores and in bookshops.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. Any more questions, Shauna? I bet you've got another one you're dying to ask.
What else could I ask you? Well, we haven't really got much time left, but I'm always interested. What are you reading at the moment?
Oh, I read an awful lot of, well, two things really. I read an awful lot of early 20th century women's fiction. So I'm reading a book called The Gentlewomen by someone called Laura Talbot. It's a really old Virago book. I should have had it with me to wave about. And I love those books, like I was saying, about women during the war. And this is about a country house where there is a governess and a secretary, and the sort of rivalry between these two women. There are 4 children and a husband who's a husband of the lady of the house who's away fighting. And it's just a really gentle picture of sort of English country life. There's a bomber station nearby, so these bombers keep going over with a sort of low droning hum. And the sort of just trying to make things work, really. Again, we're coming back to just women pulling together in not very ideal circumstances. There's a great line in the beginning of it. One of the lady of the house is waiting for this new governess to arrive, who's been living in a boarding house in Birmingham and giving private lessons. She's like, so much of the war was about waiting. It was about waiting in queues, waiting for trains, waiting from the next, air raid, waiting for an air raid to be over. You just think, yeah, there was an awful lot of waiting. And same for the men at the front, actually. Everyone says about being in the army, isn't it? It's about 10% perspiration and the rest is irritation at just hanging about. But, it's how it was. So that's what I'm reading. But I also read a lot of crime. Again, not nasty, gory, psychological slasher type stuff, but cozy crime. So Richard Osman, Step Forward, obviously. and so-called Golden Age crime. I'm a great admirer of Agatha Christie. Oh, I am just reading her biography, marked with various pages, which I think is brilliant. And you know, she again was really overlooked as a writer. You know, it's just like, oh, she just churns these little mysteries out. No, they're all quite cleverly plotted, and she was really into psychology. You know, Poirot works it out with these little grey cells, but he looks at people's psychology as well. So there we go.
Thank you. Well, yeah, just leaves me to say a big thank you to you, Joanna.
Welcome. You're welcome.
For joining us, and our audience for joining us. And I think that's been really nice in that it's Libraries Week is focused on Never Stop Learning, and I think with all the background research that you've touched upon, and you know, it's nice to think that we could all potentially go somewhere with our own writing after listening to you, and it gives, you know, encouragement to those of us that are perhaps wanting to put a foot in the water there. So that's wonderful. So
well, at the very least, you know, just write a diary. You know, if it sparked any memories of wartime, or indeed after, you know, rationing went on till 1954. So a lot of people lived in that post-war era that was just as hard in many ways, worse in the immediate years after the war, because so much assistance was having to go to Europe. So rationing, I believe, of food actually got worse. You know, bread was rationed in sort of 46, 47, when it hadn't been during the war. So, you know, it's just, and I mean, I just wish I'd asked my parents more, and there may be people in your family who don't seem very interested in your memories. It's just like, oh, it's on again. But one day they might wish that they had been. Because I certainly wish I'd asked my dad more about his war experiences. I've got some which I was able to give to Lily's brother Reg, who's in the Western Desert where my dad was. But yeah, so often when I do library talks in person, they're sort of like, yeah, I wish I'd asked my mum, dad, gran more.
Well, it's been nice for me because my gran used to live in Wolverhampton, and I know she will to the store.
Yes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for the session, and thank you for joining. Everybody who's given up their time. Oh, thank you.